And the rumors are flying, and to no one's surprise, in my opinion, but very exciting to see, the Memphis Grizzlies could emerge as one of the more pivotal players this week when it comes to making a move. The Memphis Grizzlies potentially trading up for the 4th pick in the draft, that's out there. But what to make of all that is out there? That and much more when it comes to another Rumor Roundup edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. Here we go.
Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome one and all to the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. My name is Shawn Coleman. Hope wherever you are and wherever you are listening, hope you have an outstanding, or you're having an outstanding start to your week. Obviously, you can find myself at StatsSAC on Twitter. My co-host, DeMichael Cole, he'll be back with me later this week. You can find him at DeMichaelC on Twitter. I've been covering the Grizzlies now for 4 years, credentialed media member, right for him over at Grizzly Bear Blue, right about him over at Grizzly Bear Blues, your co-host here at Locked On Grizzlies, your Grizzlies every day. Of course, you can find the show right here on YouTube. Just hit that subscribe button below, and you can find it free on all podcast platforms. Just make sure you hit the subscribe to get the latest content when it is available. Bear with me a bit here, been a little bit under the weather, but hey, when it comes to draft week, when it comes to the off season officially starting for the NBA, there's nothing that needs to stop talking about some exciting subjects. And before we do, I want to remind you also, if you enjoy betting and wagering on sports, to head to betonline.net, the fastest and easiest way for you to bet on all the sports you love. So let's round them up. The Rumor Roundup edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. Now, let's go back in time. 11 months. Now, the NBA draft last year in 2021 was actually in July. This was still fallout from the previous year in which the NBA had to change up a lot of its schedule due to COVID-19, the pandemic, what have you. This year, things are a bit more normal. The draft going on just several days after the NBA Finals in June. But it was this exact situation. It was the Monday before of draft week when the Grizzlies traded Jonas Valanciunas to the Pelicans last year for Steven Adams, Eric Bledsoe, and also they swapped the 17th pick in last year's draft for the 10th pick and eventually wound up picking Zaire Williams. Well, today there's not been a trade to speak of as of yet, but there is some exciting news. It actually started Saturday when Mark Stein mentioned that, exciting news, though no surprise to anyone, the Grizzlies were looking to trade up in this draft. They were working hard to trade up in the 2022 draft. Now, don't forget, when it comes to the Grizzlies and Zach Kleiman, they love moving around the draft board. Zach Kleiman has made 6 picks in his time as Grizzlies GM. The only player that he did not trade up to pick for is John Morant. All the other picks, Brandon Clark, Desmond Bane, Xavier Tillman, Zaire Williams, Santi Aldama, those 5 players, they all were the result of a trade up by the Grizzlies in the year that they were drafted. So the Grizzlies trading up should come as no surprise to anyone. However, some new details have emerged this morning that make things a bit more exciting. Sports Illustrated's Jeremy Woo talked about in his latest mock draft that the Grizzlies are known to be they're attempting to trade up potentially into the teens to land a player that they want, and they're also potentially willing to include with the 22nd pick a veteran player. He specifically named DeAnthony Melton, and I know that for those who have listened to Locked On Grizzlies over the past few weeks, DeMichael and I both multiple times have speculated whether or not DeAnthony Melton could potentially be a player that the Grizzlies could dangle out there in trade talks. It certainly seems as if he could be available in the right deal. But then it got a bit more exciting. Mark Stein followed up on his Saturday news nugget to add that the Grizzlies have actually talked, or it's been rumored that the Grizzlies have even inquired about the number 4 pick with the Sacramento Kings, which seems to be that 4th pick for the Sacramento Kings. That really seems to be the hot spot when it comes to a potential trade up for teams in this year's draft. Now, without a doubt, that is certainly exciting to think about, speculate on. You know, it's very enticing to think what the Grizzlies could do if they were to land the number 4 pick in this draft. One thing, though, I want to say, that and make no mistake, if the Grizzlies were to pay the price that they would have to pay to move up to get the 4th pick in this year's draft, they are going to be drafting for talent. And the likely talent that they would draft would be Purdue guard Jaden Ivey. Obviously, his connection with John Morant, that definitely stands out as a reason why the Grizzlies could be motivated to get him. But in a draft that many have considered for a while to be a top 4 draft when it comes to tiers, I think you put Jabari Smith, Chet Holmgren, and Paolo Banchero on that first tier, and then you also would then put Jaden Ivey on a second tier by himself. But there's clearly a top 4 in this draft. If the Grizzlies were to trade up to the 4th spot, I fully believe it would be for Jaden Ivey. And of course, his connection with Ja is outstanding. I think that Jaden Ivey does have the makings to have some star potential. I think he has the highest scoring floor in this draft in terms of him transitioning into a 20-a-night scorer in the NBA. I think that there is plenty of reasons for the Grizzlies to at least inquire about what it would take to get off to the 4th spot. But then, before we go too far with this, breaking down potential trades, all that different stuff, I just don't think it's all that likely for a few reasons. Number one, the Grizzlies package, the trade package that they would have to put together, I just feel there are too many other teams out there that could offer more overall value in a trade package without the Kings having to fall as far down the draft board. I think there's just too many other teams out there that can offer more valuable trade packages for the Grizzlies to overcome. That's the first thing. The second thing is what the Grizzlies would have to include to really try to overcome the fact that other teams could offer more value. And the key to that is Zaire Williams. If the Grizzlies were to include Zaire Williams in a potential trade package to move up to the 4th spot, I honestly do think the Kings would be really intrigued by that. Zaire Williams is the type of player the Kings could be really intrigued by. I know that they passed over him last year to pick Davion Mitchell, but he is the type of talent with upside that could really make it sensible for the Kings to move off that 4th pick. But then at that point, if you're having to include Zaire Williams just to move up to 4, what else are you having to include? You're likely going to have to include a Dylan Brooks or a Brandon Clark as well, plus the 22nd pick. I can tell you right now, a Brandon Clark or Dylan Brooks plus the 22nd and 29th pick, that package, like if the offer was Dylan Brooks 22 and 29, that's not getting anywhere close, I think, to what it would take to get 4. So then what would you have to include with that trade package to move up to 4, to get past what other teams could offer? It's likely going to have to be Zaire Williams. Now, as I mentioned on Twitter earlier today, I personally would rate Ivy higher than Zaire Williams in terms of prospects. I think that Jaden Ivey is a better prospect than Zaire Williams. But the difference between them as prospects, that is pretty close. And so is the difference between Zaire Williams to get to Jaden Ivey, is that difference of Dylan Brooks and another first-round pick? In my opinion, probably not. And the other thing that stands out is no matter how close Ja and Jaden are, no matter how exciting or enticing a backcourt future of Ja and Jaden would be with Desmond Bane, it also is relevant that if you're giving up a player like a Zaire Williams, you also have to consider fit. Zaire Williams is a better long-term fit for what the Grizzlies need than Jaden Ivey is. Even if you feel like I do, Jaden Ivey may be a better overall talent than Zaire Williams. So at this point, when it comes to making sense of potentially trading up to the 4th pick, if it's going to have to be including Zaire Williams to actually make it happen, that's when I become a bit skeptical. That's when I hit the pause button and I step back and I say, okay, does this really make sense? As much as I imagine the Grizzlies would love to have Jaden Ivey paired with Ja long term, as much as I feel Jaden Ivey does have legitimate star potential, it's got to make sense. At the end of the day, I know you want to amass as much talent as possible, but the Grizzlies have done a really good job of not only amassing talent, but getting talent in areas that they need. If the way for the Grizzlies to trade up to number 4 would have to be them including Zaire Williams, then it becomes hard for it to be a move that truly makes sense for Memphis, that truly long-term makes Memphis better. So my point is, at the end of the day, if there's any chance of the Grizzlies moving up at 4, I think it's just going to have to be a fleecing of the Kings. And I just don't think that's very likely. No matter how much you may feel the Kings could use or may benefit from a Brandon Clark or a Dylan Brooks, even if you were to combine those two together and then give them 22, like an offer of Brandon Clark, Dylan Brooks, and 22, I still find it hard to believe another team could not top that. So the idea of moving up to 4 to get Jaden Ivey, yes, there are multiple relevant reasons why it could make sense for Memphis. But it would come down to what price the Grizzlies would have to pay. And just as I mentioned last week, is it truly a move that is making the Grizzlies better long term? Getting a talent like Jaden Ivey, it's hard to argue against that being something that would not make the Grizzlies better. But for instance, if you would have to include Zaire Williams in the package to go get Ivey, then it becomes a question. I personally, again, while I love Ivey, and I think that he may be a better long-term prospect in terms of a star than Zaire Williams, I personally would likely not part with Zaire Williams to go get Jaden Ivey. Sure, you could probably make a deal work in the right situation. It can make sense, but it's just hard to make sense of putting a Zaire Williams in a package to move up to get Ivey for the Grizzlies. And away from the Grizzlies on the Kings side, it's hard for me to see them not being able to get a better offer from another team besides the Grizzlies to get up to 4 to get Ivey. So at the end of the day, I think there's very little chance that Memphis will be able to pull it off to move up to number 4 to get Jaden Ivey. How exciting it would be if they did that. But in the end, I think that that may be a little bit too much of a reach when it comes to paying the price and also for it to make sense. But what does make a bit more sense is the Grizzlies potentially finding a creative way to move up into the teens to go after a player or two that they might like. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But before we do, listen, just like I mentioned, you can bet pretty confidently that the Grizzlies are going to make a move on draft night, make a trade of some sort. When it comes to betting and wagering on sports in general for you, you want to make it simple. You want to make it easy. You want to make it to where you don't have to focus on setting up the way for you to bet. Your focus wants to be on the data that you need to make bets confidently. Well, if you want the fastest and easiest way for you to bet on all the sports you love is betonline.net, whether it be your mobile device, whether it be your laptop, what have you, betonline.net is the best setup for you. All you got to do is just go to betonline.net, set up whatever wagers you want to bet, and then it will have all the information that you need. Check out betonline.net today when it comes to all of your betting needs. Of course, we want to remind you that when it comes to NBA draft night, we're going to have you covered here on the Locked On Podcast Network. One live NBA draft show is not enough for Locked On. Every show is going live on draft night. So join me 15 minutes after our pick at Locked On Grizzlies on YouTube for the immediate reaction from your local experts. Subscribe now to Locked On Grizzlies so you know when we will go live. So, of course, the Grizzlies are continuing to be, it's always fun being involved in this time of the NBA season because it's not just that the Grizzlies are looking to make moves. It's the fact that now when the Grizzlies are making moves, it likely is going to be a move that they're going to benefit from. Not only from the Grizzlies drafting and developing well, but also knowing how to use the assets that they have to move up and get the players that they want. Again, if the Grizzlies really want to go get Jaden Ivey, they have the tools to go get it, I'm sure. Is it the most sensible move? Does it make it better long term? I think that honestly is a fair question, especially if you have to include Zaire Williams. That's why I don't think it's all that likely that the Grizzlies will actually be a player for a top 4 pick. But where the Grizzlies do emerge as potentially being a player is moving into the teens of this draft to get a player that they like. On Saturday, when it was discussed from Mark Stein that the Grizzlies were potentially looking to move up in the draft, I threw out there on Twitter that I felt that the 13th through 16th picks, that's the hot zone that Memphis could look to trade up because you have logical connections. You have a logical basis for a trade to form with each of the teams in those spots when it comes to the Grizzlies moving up from 22 to that area. At 13 and 15, you've got the Charlotte Hornets. We know the Hornets badly want a big man. We know that they've probably been talking with the Indiana Pacers about Miles Turner. But what if the Grizzlies would be willing to part with Steven Adams and perhaps willing to take on the contract of Gordon Hayward, who, the Hornets likely would like to move off of their pursuit of re-signing Miles Bridges? That's a potential way where the Grizzlies, once again, just like they did last year, taking on the unwanted contracts of Eric Bledsoe and Steven Adams. If the Grizzlies were to once again take on an unwanted contract, they could move up to 13. They potentially could even move up to 14 if they might be willing to take a Kevin Love contract away from the Cavaliers. So the Grizzlies do have ways in which they can move up to 13 and 14. The Cavaliers may, if the Hornets wanted Steven Adams to be that type of low usage center to benefit their young ball club like he did the Grizzlies this past season, perhaps it could make sense for the Grizzlies to move up to 13. Perhaps Cleveland, who may lose Colin Sexton this offseason, perhaps they like the idea of having another backcourt relevant talent in DeAnthony Melton. So the Grizzlies could possibly move 22 and DeAnthony Melton to Cleveland to get 14, while also potentially taking on the contract of Kevin Love. The Grizzlies not having that Lakers pick really does get in the way of them being able to do what they truly do this offseason. I know that there's only so much, you can talk about that because it's not anything that the Grizzlies did. It was out of their control. But the fact that they don't have the Lakers pick this year now, it means that they're going to have to get more creative to truly do what they want to do. I think that it's sensible for the Grizzlies to want to move up from that 13 into that 13 to 16 area. But I think that they're going to have to get more creative in the fact that they're once again going to have to potentially use their cap space to take on an unwanted contract, or they may have to part with a talent like a Steven Adams or a DeAnthony Melton that they don't necessarily want to, though they might have to get a player that they truly wanted. And I think that when you get to that 13 to 14 range, the reason why it potentially makes sense for the Grizzlies to make that type of move is, as I've stated multiple times, if the Grizzlies were to trade up, A.J. Griffin and Jalen Duren become my top two targets. I think that you're still probably a bit too far down the draft board to draft either one of them, even if they fall a bit. But at the very least, if you get to 13 or 14, you may then be able to make another move to move up to get one of those top two talents. Those would be my top two trade options moving up to the 13th or 14th spot in the draft. Now, if the Grizzlies were to look at potentially moving to 15 or 16, you've still got the Steven Adams, Gordon Hayward swap situation. Throw in the pieces that need to make it work. But the Grizzlies could move up to 15 by doing that. Or they potentially could move up to 16 with the Hawks. We know that the Hawks have potentially looked at the idea of trading John Collins in 16 to move up in the draft. It seems as if the Hawks in many different scenarios could be attracted to the idea of moving the 16th pick. But if the Hawks were to perhaps move a Bogdan Bogdanovic or a Kevin Huerter, we know that they've had interest in DeAnthony Melton in the past. Could the Grizzlies potentially use the 16th pick and use the 22nd pick in DeAnthony Melton to move up to 16? That could be a possibility. We've seen those type of trades before where, yes, you don't want to part with the DeAnthony Melton freely, but if you feel that you're truly getting a piece that's going to be much more coveted long-term than DeAnthony Melton, then it makes sense to make the move. So I don't think that 4 is actually in play for the Grizzlies. But I do think, going in along with what Jeremy Woo sent out as information about the Grizzlies potentially wanting to move up into the teens, I do think that the Grizzlies have ways in which they can move up the draft board, while also, as Jeremy Woo mentioned as well, also not having to give up their 29th pick, which it appears the Grizzlies want to keep, and draft a player, even if it's a player that may not contribute in year one. The Grizzlies want to keep that 29th pick so that they have good cost effectiveness on a talent over the next several years as they develop them into hopefully what will be a significant piece. So while 4 may be a bit hard to actually make a reality, it's sensible to see how the Grizzlies can move up from 22 to 13 through 16. Perhaps they take on an unwanted contract like a Gordon Hayward or a Kevin Love from Charlotte or Cleveland and a move up to 13 or 14. Or perhaps they dangle a veteran that makes sense for Charlotte with Steven Adams, or that we know a team has liked in the past, like Atlanta has liked DeAnthony Melton. Again, is it likely, or is there a high percentage that the Grizzlies can make this work to where they can move up into the teens? I don't necessarily know, because there are other teams who likely have better overall packages. For instance, if the Rockets wanted to move up, they could offer 17 and 26 in a package deal to move up in the draft. If the Spurs wanted to move up, they could offer 20 and 25. So once again, there are other teams out there that could put together more attractive packages in terms of picks. But if the Grizzlies were to have a player that they don't necessarily feel is untouchable, that could be attractive to another team, and they're willing to put that player along with the 22nd pick together to move up in the draft, the Grizzlies may be able to find a taker. And if they can move up in the draft, then you start getting into the area of some players that truly make sense. But while AJ Griffin and Jalen Duren falling may be my two top targets, I've also talked about Ousmane Dieng as being a target as well. A couple of other players that I think could make sense for Memphis are Malachi Branham and Tari Eason, but for completely different reasons. I'll discuss that in just a moment. Of course, we want to thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen of the day. As we continue throughout this week, we'll be breaking down more prospects while also breaking down the latest when it comes to potential rumors, or even if the Grizzlies were to make a move before draft night, we'll have you covered right here. Now, that is one of the things that I want to talk about real quickly, is that I don't think that there is as much potential this year that the Grizzlies make a move days before the draft like they did last year. Because last year, I feel the reason why the Grizzlies were okay moving to the 10th spot in the draft days before it happened, instead of letting the draft board kind of fall as it may and then making the move. I honestly think last year, and the Grizzlies probably did have an understanding with Zaire that if he was there at 10, he would be the guy they would take. But I think overall, the reason why the Grizzlies made the move they did last year to get up to that 10th spot, they were satisfied with many options that could fit their biggest need. They were satisfied if any one of them fell to that 10th spot. I'm talking about Josh Giddey, Jonathan Kuminga, Franz Wagner, or Zaire Williams. Last year, the Grizzlies moved up to 10 because they had several options that could make sense to fit what they were looking for. This year, while the Grizzlies probably do have a few targets that they want to trade up for, I don't necessarily know if there is as much wiggle room as if there is 3 or 4 targets that if any of them were to fall to a certain spot in the draft, the Grizzlies are fine moving up to get that player. In other words, I think that the likelihood that the Grizzlies make a move this year, it likely happens on draft night after seeing how the draft board will actually fall on draft night. And if that's the case, I think that a few other names besides AJ Griffin, Jalen Duren, Mark Williams, Ousmane Dieng, who I've already discussed, a couple of other trade-up targets that could be sensible for me are Tari Eason and Malachi Branham. Now, I mentioned Malachi Branham, who's a freshman guard from Ohio State. Incredible efficiency for a freshman, especially from the mid-range. One of the reasons why I think that it could make sense for the Grizzlies to trade up to get a Branham is because the Grizzlies are looking at having to pay Tyus Jones to keep him in free agency. That the Grizzlies are having to pay $18 to $19 million to DeAnthony Melton over the next 2 years, which is still a bargain. Don't get me wrong. But if the Grizzlies feel that a player like a Malachi Branham, who I do think overall has a higher upside than a Tyus or a Melton long term, if the Grizzlies feel that either Tyus Jones may be priced out of their range in free agency, or if they feel strongly about retaining Tyus, they just don't want to pay nearly $20 million over the next few years to both Tyus and DeAnthony Melton combined, it makes sense to me for the Grizzlies to make a move up to get a player who potentially has higher upside than Jones or Melton, but is also going to be on a much cheaper contract. And I think at the end of the day, the Grizzlies would love to have a player who kind of is Tyus and DeAnthony combined. Now, in that type of player, you're not getting the defensive upside or the turnover-causing chaos upside of a DeAnthony Melton. You're also not getting the elite historic decision-making of a Tyus Jones. You're not getting that in this potential player. But if the Grizzlies feel that, for instance, a Malachi Branham is a player that could offer more shooting consistency than a DeAnthony Melton, also could potentially offer more playmaking ability, and could at least be somewhat capable on defense, that may be more of a fit long-term for the Grizzlies than what DeAnthony Melton offers. DeAnthony Melton's defense is incredible. His ability to create positive plays when he's on is incredible. When he is shooting, DeAnthony Melton, when he's making his threes, DeAnthony Melton is one of the most valuable bench players in the NBA. But his inconsistency at times, especially in the playoffs, can be a bit frustrating. So if Memphis likes the idea of moving on from his contract, but also getting a player on a much cheaper contract who they feel may have higher upside than DeAnthony Melton, I could see that making sense. And I think Malachi Branham is that type of player, a player who shows very good efficiency, which shows that his decision-making on shots is very advanced for his age, has some playmaking upside. He's not, I don't ever think Malachi Branham is going to be a lead guard for a team, but he could be that complementary secondary playmaker that you could play next to John Morant if you were going to sit Desmond Bain or what have you. And I also think that with a 6'10" wingspan, Branham in good effort, he does provide effort on defense. I think that there's plenty to work with to where whatever offensive value that Branham offers you when he's on the court, it's not taken away from being a liability on defense. This may be a stretch. Why would the Grizzlies trade Melton just to get a potential replacement for him that you're not certain becomes Melton or certain becomes better than Melton? I get it. This may be a bit of a stretch. But I do think that Malachi Branham, if the Grizzlies like the idea long-term of having a player that could be kind of a combination of Tyus and DeAnthony Melton, I think that Branham is that type of talent. And so for that reason, I could see him being a trade-up target for the Grizzlies if they were to move up 3 to 5 spots, if they were to move up to 16, 17, what have you. The other player becomes a bit more sensible. I think that this trade target is a bit more sensible for Memphis than a Malachi Branham, though, I think that you could certainly support the idea of moving up to get a player like Branham. But the other player is Tari Eason, small forward, power forward out of Louisiana State University. One of the things that stands out about Tari Eason is his defensive versatility. He legitimately has some of the highest defensive upside in this draft, to the point of even being a player who in time could make a few All-NBA defensive teams. You've got switchability, a player that could arguably guard 4, maybe even 5 spots on the court, a 6'8" body frame with a 7'2" wingspan, a player, the reason why he's so highly thought of on defense is because of the multiple ways he can make an impact. He can create turnovers. He can switch onto many different positions. He can be a great help defender. He can be someone that can do a great job one-on-one. Tari Eason is the type of defender that NBA teams would love to have. We hear all the time, when it comes to contenders at the trade deadline, they're looking for wing defenders. Well, having that type of defensive upside in a player that you have on cheap for 4 years, that is what makes it so enticing for the Grizzlies, a team that has been looking for that type of player. We've seen them make moves for Josh Jackson, Justice Winslow, Jarrett Culver. Tari Eason fits that mold as a hyper-athletic player with good defensive upside. He fits the mold of a player the Grizzlies have tried to find for years. Well, now, if you could find him on a 4-year contract and you get him into the development track of the Grizzlies that have been able to improve the shot of players like Tari Eason for years now, look at Kyle Anderson, Melton, and others, then you've got a pretty exciting addition to this Grizzlies team. Because we know that around John Morant, you need as much defense as possible. We know that the Grizzlies may not necessarily want to pay Dillon Brooks what he'll be seeking in a year or so. So getting another high-level defender to put on the wing, 3 and a 4, possibly pairing with Zaire or, combining with Zaire to be on the court for 40-plus minutes a night, that is highly intriguing. Now, if the Grizzlies could get Tari Eason and then help him develop into a player that could be comfortable shooting the 3 from the corner to go along with him being a good cutter to the basket, now you've got a low-usage player on offense who still can provide value with his rebounding, his cutting, and his overall ability to catch and shooting 3-pointers. At the end of the day, when it comes to Tari Eason, what's going to make the difference between him being, a good defensive depth piece or potentially being a long-term starter in the league is going to be his ability to shoot. He showed flashes of it at LSU, but can you put him into positions to where he can shoot confidently and be an outlet for shooting and scoring when needed on offense? That's what ultimately is going to decide. That's one of those swing skill categories that will ultimately decide the long-term future of Tari Eason. But when it comes to what the Grizzlies covet, we know that they love defense, and we know that they, again, have been targeting for years an athletic, big wing with good defensive upside. Tari Eason fits that mold perfectly. And I also think there are a few teams out there who are better fits to help his offensive game mature significantly than the Grizzlies. So if trading up to number 4 really doesn't make sense, then that 13 to 16 range does make some sense for Memphis. But if they weren't able to get up to 13 or 14, if it's potentially just a few spots up to 17 or 16, 17, 18, I think Tari Eason certainly makes sense. Now, there's a lot of teams he makes sense for, but I find it hard to believe there are any team or potentially any teams out there that would be a better place for Tari Eason to land with his skill set, because we know the Grizzlies covet that type of big wing defensive upside like Tari Eason would be able to offer. But also, I think there are a few, if any, teams out there who could help his offensive game develop as well to where he can become a significant rotation player in the NBA. So a lot of rumors are out there, a lot of fun speculating. It'll be interesting to see if the Grizzlies make a move before or during draft night. But it's not just about the move up to 4 that should get you excited. It's the potential move up in general that, once again, the Grizzlies are moving up to get a player they covet. They've done it many times over the past few years, and every single time we've looked at it and it's made sense. So some of the picks still kind of out there. Some deal done, but we'll see. But my point is that if the Grizzlies are focused on making a move on draft night, we can get excited to know that it's going after a player they truly covet. And as they've shown time and time again over the past few years, when the Grizzlies get a player they truly covet, they can help that player make the most of their potential quickly and consistently. And that's exciting to see in this draft. Can't thank you enough for checking us out here at Locked On Grizzlies. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube. Leave a comment below. Also, free on all podcast platforms. Just hit that subscribe button to get the latest content. My name's Shawn Coleman. DeMichael Cole will be back with me later on this week. We'll keep you covered here at Locked On Grizzlies as a draft week gets started and the NBA offseason is getting into full swing. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon next time here on Locked On.